is my Philosophy of Education podcast. In this podcast, I'll be examining the work of social theorist, metaphysical philosopher, biologist, poet, and teacher Henry David Thoreau. Through this exploration of his life and works, I will synthesize two conclusions. Number one, that traditional education, beyond being superannuated, could have in fact never been timely at all. And number two, that intellectual quality in all the adjectives prescribed by the QTF can be and have been achieved through experiential learning. These seem like basic premises to begin our discussion. They are not, however, predispositions. These are some basic truth statements, if you will, that I have arrived at after close to 4 years of university level study. As far as undergraduate research goes, this is my own evidence-based practice or philosophy.
So I'm going to talk about Henry David Thoreau. If you want to know more biographical details, you can Google him. Multi-literate age. Now, Thoreau's career as a classroom teacher began inauspiciously, and his mainstream career lasted only 2 weeks. In 1837, he resigned from his posting because he refused to punish students with the cane. This anecdote is just the beginning of many that serve to illustrate the man's prescience in educational theory. Shortly after his run-in with traditional pedagogy, Thoreau and his brother John established their own school. Thoreau firmly believed, preceding Dewey and Vygotsky, that experience was the only real teacher a human, not just a student, needed. The small school was an experiment in inquiry-based learning. Students there learned real skills that were relevant to their life and context: gardening, boat making, hunting, fishing, trapping. The outdoors were seamlessly integrated with the conceptual curriculum. The world around Concord in the 1830s was that a boy learned more in a month at the Thoreau School than elsewhere in town. Thoreau held a seemingly anachronistic view of the human person in the early 19th century. In his famous text called Walden, which I'll address later, he uses an interesting metaphor of a house filled with different characters, all living under the same roof. These characters inhabit the space without dividing walls, a studio, if you will. They can all see each other, these characters, these diverse characters. They're all symbolic of the many facets and the multiplicity of our psyche. The goal of real education is for these characters living under the roof to know each other intimately, so that they can be collective, so they can act collectively and meet the challenges that the world will present to them. Thoreau purported that the individual educated in the traditional system was completely unaware of their hidden talents, these characters. I can hear Ken Robinson in this. In this very simple metaphor, Thoreau manages to explain the needs for a person's knowledge of the self. Thoreau was preaching metacognition 175 years ago. Thoreau's view of industrial education was that the human person was also similar to his bean field. Now, as Thoreau was writing Walden, his seminal text, he was living self-sufficiently in a log cabin. But I'll talk more about that later. Now, Thoreau's bean field. He deliberately left half of it uncultivated, and he recognized the importance of the wild and unproductive aspect of that small farm ecosystem, as weeds, large bushes, insects, beavers, etc. all played a part in the balance. This second metaphor uses an ecological analogy common in educational discourse. What the state may define as a weed may be your own personal efficacy. How many students are still failing and dropping out in school because their talents and dreams are outside? He did not refuse public education altogether. Rather, he simply recognized that education helps to create democracy, but it also serves to destroy it, depending on the nature of the education. Thoreau's antidote was experience. Experience is the key to real understanding. I now mean to springboard my philosophy of education from the philosophy of Thoreau and John Dewey, to emphasize the importance of metacognition, creativity, and inquiry through experience. I'm not going to sit here and claim that all traditional classrooms negate the possibility of valuable learning experiences. That would effectively render my education a fiction. Rather, I'd like to suggest that theory be an offshoot of practice. In other words, the meaning and significance of curriculum must be actively constructed by the student. I will again reference Kahn and his criteria for progressive education: tending to the whole child, community collaboration, social justice, intrinsic motivation, deep understanding, active learning and taking kids seriously. I chose to talk about Thoreau because he is both polemic on the topic of education and prolific as an author. This prolificacy I am referring to is his famous discourse called Walden. A few years preceding the closure of his school because of his brother's death, Thoreau embarked on a kind of metaphysical, pragmatic endeavour on Walden Pond, just outside Concord, Massachusetts. Thoreau lived here in this shack for 2 years, self-sufficiently. He taught himself biology, wrote poems, farmed, and inquired into the meaning of life, politics, nature, and humanity. This all comes to us through his writing. What I'm proposing is that students undertake the same kind of projects. To quote Thoreau here, I mean that students should not play life or study it merely, but earnestly live it from beginning to end. How could youths better learn to live than by at once trying to experiment with living? This is a contentious notion. I don't mean that all students should go and live in a log cabin for 2 years and write a novel. But Walden, the text, is in fact an inquiry-based project. It could even be viewed as a problem-based learning, as Thoreau started with a number of philosophical questions. Could I distill my human person down to its base elements and truly know myself by living self-sufficiently? Could I reach perfect harmony with nature? These are the kind of self-affirming and incredibly self-empowering pursuits that students of the postmodern age really need, most critically in adolescence. I can see no other better project suited to the existential questions of teenhood. Now that I've addressed my two opening propositions, that even in Thoreau's time, traditional education did not meet the needs of individual humans, and two, that significant and even existential understanding comes from experience, intrinsically fueled, I can finish by linking the implications of Thoreau's political writing to the cross-curriculum objectives of the new Australian curriculum. Thoreau is commonly disregarded in political and social studies as a self-indulgent hermit and 19th century romantic. This is because Thoreau, much like the existentialists who preceded him in the 20th century, believed that a self-governing individual is infinitely more political, morally conscious, and responsible than a well-indoctrinated student of traditional education and institutions. Here we can see a parallel to the Australian curriculum and its emphasis on ethics, citizenship, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, and sustainability, which I think Thoreau would appreciate that one. Thoreau believed a deep and real human education through experience meant that individuals become self-governing and no longer relinquish their moral obligations to the government. You might call this an autonomous curriculum of selfhood. Ruth Lane, in her essay on Thoreau's self-government, called this difference between irresponsible self-maximization and mature political personhood. I don't think it's a utopian idea. I think it's really worth planning for. I hope you've enjoyed. Peace.